A few years ago, I rented a small cabin deep in the woods for a weekend getaway. I needed a break from the chaos of city life, and the idea of being surrounded by nothing but snow and silence sounded perfect. It was the middle of January, and the snowstorm that had been forecasted hit just as I arrived. Thick flakes fell relentlessly, covering everything in a heavy white blanket. The first night was uneventful. I had a fire going, and the warmth of the cabin made it feel cozy despite the howling wind outside. But by the second night, things took a turn. I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind blowing branches against the glass. But when I looked outside, there were no trees close enough to the cabin to cause that sound. I brushed it off and went back to bed, but the tapping continued. It became more deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. My unease grew, and I decided to check outside. Grabbing a flashlight, I opened the door to a wall of cold air. The snow was piled high, and the only footprints I could see were my own from earlier. That's when I noticed something odd. The tapping wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the side of the cabin. I shone my flashlight in that direction and froze. There were faint tracks in the snow leading around the corner, but they didn't look human. They were too long, with what appeared to be claw marks at the tips. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with a knife in my hand, jumping at every sound. By morning, the tracks were gone, erased by the fresh snow. I left that cabin as soon as the roads were clear and never looked back. Even now, I can't explain what made those tracks or who or what was outside my cabin that night. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to a remote cabin alone, especially during a snowstorm. When I was a teenager, my family lived near a large frozen lake. It was a popular spot for skating and ice fishing during the winter, but there was one part of the lake everyone avoided. Locals called it Dead Man's Hollow, and the stories about it were enough to keep most people away. One night, my friends and I decided to skate out to the hollow as a dare. It was late, and the lake was eerily quiet. The only sound was the scraping of our skates against the ice. As we got closer to the hollow, the air felt colder, almost unnaturally so. That's when we saw it. A figure was standing in the middle of the hollow, completely still. At first, we thought it was someone ice fishing, but as we got closer, we realized it wasn't moving at all. It looked like a person, but there was something off about its posture. Its limbs were too long, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. One of my friends called out, but there was no response. The figure didn't move. It didn't even flinch. That's when we noticed the cracks forming in the ice around it. Without thinking, we turned and skated back as fast as we could. When I glanced over my shoulder, the figure was gone. The next morning, we told a few locals what we had seen. One old man nodded and said, "That's why we don't go near the hollow. It's not safe." He wouldn't say anything more, but his tone made it clear that he believed us. Years later, I still think about that night. Was it just an illusion? A trick of the light on the ice? Or was there something truly sinister in Dead Man's Hollow? This happened to me when I was driving home from a Christmas party late at night. A blizzard had rolled in unexpectedly, and the roads were almost impossible to navigate. Visibility was terrible, and I could barely see a few feet in front of my car. I was driving slowly, trying to stay on the road, when I saw someone standing in the middle of the lane. They were wearing a hooded coat, and their face was obscured by the snow. I slowed down and rolled down my window to ask if they needed help. But before I could say anything, they turned and walked into the woods. It didn't make sense. There were no houses or buildings nearby, just miles of trees and snow. Against my better judgment, I pulled over and grabbed a flashlight. I wanted to make sure they weren't in trouble. I followed their footprints into the woods for about 10 minutes before they just stopped. The snow around me was undisturbed, as if they had vanished into thin air. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread and turned back to my car. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got home, I checked my car in the light and noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were handprints on the back window, as if someone had been watching me the entire time. That night, I barely slept. The image of those handprints stayed with me, and I've avoided driving in blizzards ever since. One of my friends called out, but there was no response. The figure didn't move. It didn't even flinch. That's when we noticed the cracks forming in the ice around it. Without thinking, we turned and skated back as fast as we could. When I glanced over my shoulder, the figure was gone. The next morning, we told a few locals what we had seen. One old man nodded and said, "That's why we don't go near the hollow. It's not safe." He wouldn't say anything more, but his tone made it clear that he believed us. Years later, I still think about that night. Was it just an illusion, a trick of the light on the ice? Or was there something truly sinister in Dead Man's Hollow? A few winters ago, I was staying with my cousin in a rural area. Their house backed up to a forest, and during the winter, the trees looked like skeletal hands reaching into the sky. One morning, after a heavy snowfall, we noticed something strange in the backyard, a set of footprints leading from the forest to the house. The odd thing was, there were no return prints. It was as if someone had walked to the house and vanished. The tracks were deep and distinct, so we knew it wasn't an animal. My cousin joked that it was probably a ghost, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it gave me. That night, we heard faint scratching sounds coming from the back door. When we checked, there was nothing there, but the footprints had gotten closer. They now stopped just a few feet from the door. We decided to stay up and keep watch, but nothing else happened that night. The next morning, the footprints were gone, covered by fresh snow. We never figured out who or what made them, but I still get chills thinking about it. Whatever it was, it felt like it was toying with us, watching and waiting.